Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone that is attending this conference and to everyone that is going to see this video later. Some technicalities before we start session 3. Note that this session is being recorded, but no attendees can be seen or heard, and you should be muted on arrival. And I would like to ask participants to please stay on mute through the entire session. Please use the WUBA app or the Zoom chat box in the web browser or mobile app to ask questions to Anders and Sheri at any time. And please include your name and organization because we want to know who you are and where you're coming from. And remember that the hashtag that we are using for this conference is CCCR 2020. And I would also like to thank Tom McLean, who is joining us, who you should be able to see on your screen and who will be live drawing the entire conference. Sheri, if you could also join us, turning your computer on, please. You must have received a message saying to click it and to join our panel. In the meantime, perfect. I can see you perfectly, Sheri. Welcome. So in the meantime, welcome to the session. Are we nearly there yet? Taking the long-term view of humanity. So here we will be aiming to find the answer to different type of questions. So some of them could be, what is your long-term view for humanity? Is what you envision the same as someone in Peru, perhaps? Is it the same as a policymaker in your same country? Or is it the same about the same vision that maybe your partner has? Have you asked her or have you asked him? So that would be interesting to know. And something that is very important is to think, how can we motivate people to take a long-term or a cosmic view of humanity? Sometimes it's so far away that it's really difficult to grasp on it. So I also want you to ask you, do we have a cosmic responsibility? Do you think that are we the only ones in this known universe? What do you think about that? Just tell us in the chat. It will be great to know your views. Also important, what can we learn about the future of our species if we survive, and why does this matter? So there are many questions that are going to be discussing during these two presentations, and that I invite you to look at the presentations that Sheri and Anders have prepared. Thank you.
This is a talk about how big and how long and how good the future could possibly be. So humanity has not been around for that long. Anatomically modern humans showed up on the scene for about 100,000 years ago, and written history is just a few thousand years. Yet the universe is about 13.7 billion years old. And before us, there was a tremendously long period of time where immensely grand processes were occurring. And by symmetry, we should assume that the future could at least be equally big. And my argument here is that it's possible to somewhat rigorously analyze these possibilities and try to see how much can be achieved by humanity or humanity's successors or other forms of intelligent life, and analyze also how good are they according to different value systems. One of the problems when speaking about the future is that human action and culture and luck, they are unpredictable. Even if you don't believe that we have free will, we're still chaotic, complex systems that are hard to predict. And we are living in an interactive way that also generates behaviors that amplify random factors that we don't know very much about. Fashion and markets are anti-predictable. You earn a good living by doing what people don't expect you to do. And as Karl Popper pointed out, we can't predict what ideas we will be getting in the future, because then we would already have them. Yet we can use known physics to place conservative upper bounds of what's possible. We can also use exploratory engineering, that is, making blueprints for imaginary technologies, still based on what engineering and physics we understand, to show that this would be possible if somebody put together the parts in the right way. So in the following, I'm going to give a very brief overview of things that have shown up in my research to get a sense of just how much future there is and how grandiose it could be. I'm not going to give strong motivations for this. I'm very happy to have that during the question period or discuss it later. But I want to show that it looks like the future could make the past look rather pale. First of all, if we survive and get our act together, it looks like we can achieve post-scarcity societies. That is, we can continue growing our material wealth in a sustainable way, probably far, far beyond what the levels we currently have in the developed world. There are good reasons to believe this based on our understanding of biology and of nanotechnology. Recycling is possible once you have nanotechnology and enough energy. Can we get enough energy? Well, it looks like solar power and some other renewables are set to become significant enough, maybe supplemented by a bit of nuclear power, and that is even leaving out potential for things like fusion power, to actually power endless recycling. It also looks like developments in artificial intelligence is enabling not just material post-scarcity, but also service post-scarcity, that we might reduce the amount of labor we need to do in order to reach these material heights. Also, trends in longevity and health and biotechnology suggest that we are, in the long run at least, likely to enjoy far greater health and well-being and mental capacity in the past. We are already seeing health spans increasing tremendously just because of relatively basic medicine, simple things like vaccines, but also things like improved working safety and better nutrition. Current results in biogerontology point at ways of slowing down aging and a lot of other interesting potentials for improving our health. It also looks like biotechnology and agricultural technology enables indefinite sustainable existence. It's worth noticing that right now, most work on sustainability aims at making us more sustainable, rather than figuring out the end game. But one can also analyze it as a kind of existence proof, closed ecosystems, and demonstrate that it's possible to actually have agricultural systems that perfectly recycle everything indefinitely. Of course, we might not want to just survive for 1 billion years. The biosphere has about 1 billion years to go before the sun starts becoming too bright to maintain it. But we might actually want to put up a solar shade and add literally billions of years to the lifespan of the biosphere. No matter if it's use to humanity, we might still want to do it for its own sake. But of course, expanding to space also would enable humanity to grow much bigger. The solar system has at least the resources for populations up to about 10 trillion. Now, were we to also make the jump to nearby stars and then continue from there, we would get access to the Milky Way. This might happen using sublight transport. If you have fusion power and nanotechnology, it's possible to settle in the Oort cloud, and these Oort cloud objects do over time overlap between solar systems, so one could imagine a slow population growth and spreading between habitats eventually encompassing the galaxy. One can also go faster, of course, using, for example, laser propulsion, like proposed by the Breakthrough Starshot project, that aims at sending small probes at 20% of light speed to nearby stars within a few decades. That's obviously a too small spacecraft to send an entire human, let alone a settling population. But we might imagine using nanotechnology to send these probes to our solar system, have them wrap around an asteroid, build a bit of solar panels, build a little bit of factories, build more solar panels, and convert that asteroid into a beachhead that could then be turned into a habitat, maybe filled with a biosphere and humans, or maybe be settled by robots or software post-humans. This way, the Milky Way could become home for at least 10 to the power of 29 people. One could also repeat this over intergalactic distances, if one were to travel sufficiently fast to spread across a fairly sizable chunk of the visible universe, up to 4.7 gigaparsec, and that would allow at least 10 to the power of 38 people, an unimaginably large number of human lives. What would we want to do with the universe? Well, survival is an obvious thing. And even if we just survive as long as other mammalian species, that's still a matter of many hundreds of thousands of years. Yet, if we manage to control existential risk and ward off many of the bigger risks, we could probably survive as long as the Earth's biosphere remains, on the order of 1 billion years. Were we to settle the solar system, we can live there at least until the sun starts turning into a red giant and it's time to leave. That's 5 billion years. Yet if we settle just the Milky Way, we have the Stelliferous era with literally trillions of years ahead of us. And if we were to use, for example, fusion power or accretion disk of black hole or other forms of artificial energy sources, then it looks like one could survive well into the degenerate era, up until the point where our kind of baryonic matter becomes unstable, somewhere beyond 10 to the power of 33 years. What do we do during that time? Well, most activities of a civilization are dependent on information processing. Falling in love might not necessarily have at its core an information processing thing. The feeling of love, maybe that's an undefinable qualia. Yet you need to remember who you're in love with. You need to actually do something about your feelings. And similarly, trade, art, science, philosophy, sport, soap operas, all of them are various forms of information processing and communication. You might argue that what gives them true meaning might not be captured in bits and bytes. And that might perhaps be true, but those bits and bytes are necessary. If you do not do that processing, then we cannot actually do the philosophy or religion, etc. That means that the physics of information allows us to put some bounds on how much activity a civilization can do, because there is only so much mass energy that can be converted into irreversible computations. And it turns out that these bounds are rather loose. There is apparently space for about a Google 10 to the 100 computations at least. And if we master how to do reversible computation, that's much more energy efficient, or quantum computation that might be exponentially more powerful, we get far more computing power. One example of exploratory engineering that has a long tradition is Dyson spheres. I already mentioned using self-replicating technology, and this is a standard example of what you can use it for. You take an asteroid, you convert it into robots that convert into solar panels and more robots, and eventually you pick apart a few of the larger asteroids in the asteroid belt and end up with solar panels covering the sun, orbiting around it in a vast sphere. This would give our descendants, or for that matter us if we survive long enough, something like 10 to the 26 watts of power. Several square astronomical units of living area, if you want to use it to live on. Used as a computer, it can perform 10 to the 49 operations per second. If you put sensors on the outside, we have a telescope that can see over vast distances. And putting antennas on it allows communication over intergalactic distances, or if you focus the stellar energy to vaporize annoying planets within a few light years. It can power spacecraft over vast distances, like I discussed earlier, but it can also move entire stars. It turns out that starlight, just reflected starlight, is enough to nudge stars very slowly over a matter of millions of years so they can perform two-body encounters, which produce velocity shifts that are comparative to the stellar motion speeds of tens of kilometers per second. By having further three-body encounters, you can store energy in binary systems, you can put stars in a hovering orbit or redirect them and control them in various ways. This can be used to literally move galaxies. We can throw binary star systems close to the central black hole, ejecting one as a hypervelocity star, slowly pushing the galaxy in the opposite direction. Or we might want to send stars and other material away to remote galaxies to build up artificial hyperclusters that are resistant to the accelerating expansion of the universe. This way, we can keep together a large number of stars and galaxies that would otherwise be lost from each other and in an era of isolation in a few 100 billion years. This kind of project requires, of course, planning, literally on the billion-year timescale, and it requires enormous computational capacity But then again, it also presupposes Dyson spheres that would have achieved that. It might also be possible to transport even vaster amount of matter by converting it to energy, beaming it over, and then converting it back. But this remains far more theoretical. So it seems like life might actually be a phase transition of matter that matters for describing the entire universe. So there is an end of greatness scale, about 200 megaparsec wide, beyond which it's believed the universe is more or less homogeneous. Yet we have seen that if advanced civilizations decide to go out and reorganize the matter to their liking, they could rearrange things at least on the scale of 50 megaparsecs. That's a large galactic cluster. And of course, if they wanted to spread, maybe just settle a lot of planets and spread life or happiness or computation there, they could do it over much vaster regions, 4.7 gigaparsecs if they're fast. And the distance between these bubbles is set, of course, by the probability of life and intelligence emerging in the first place, which is currently unknown but could be much bigger. The interesting thing is that describing the universe at late times might require us to have a description of what life wants to do with it. Because the civilizations in the universe, they determine the cosmological structure on the significant large scales. Leaving out intelligence from the universe means that we actually haven't described it very well. And the structure is also dependent on what these civilizations choose to do. It might be that we want to maximize happiness. It might be that they want to make paper clips because they had a slip up with artificial intelligence. It might be that they want to maximize diversity. It might be that each of these spheres is utterly different. Now, the amount of time ahead of us is enormously vast. So Martin Rees coined the wonderful term physical eschatology for using cosmology to think about how the universe might evolve in the future, given our current understanding. The interesting thing here is to observe that we can make fairly good predictions about long time spans and then see how that both affects what intelligence can do and what intelligence can do to change these things. Like, for example, rearranging stars to prevent the evaporation of galaxies in something like 10 to the 25 years. But it also has another important implication. We live extremely early in the history of the universe. The Stelliferous era has just started. We might be slightly behind the peak star formation, but there are literally trillions of years to go. And the total future value at stake is literally astronomical. The large number, as I mentioned, even if you think they only partially turn into value, they indicate that there are many lives, much activity, much knowledge, so many things that might matter. So it seems like we should rush to the spacecraft and try to expand into the universe, because we're literally losing a few galaxies per year because of expansion of the universe. Yet, if we flub things right now, if we go extinct over the next few years because of some bioengineered pandemic or mishap with artificial intelligence, we lose the entire future. We might actually need to be very, very careful because we might gain much more by reducing existential risk right now, right here at the start, than rushing in order to maybe, just maybe, get one of those galaxies. So the paradoxical situation is that optimism about the long-term future leads to caution in the near term. And this is more due to the cheapness of time than the grandness of the future. Even if the future was relatively modest, there is so much of it that we can afford to be careful. So to conclude, it looks like there is potential for a tremendously big and bright future, almost no matter what ethical system you have, almost no matter what value theory you have. And that means that we need to be very careful right now. We have a range of possible future lives somewhere between 800 billion, assuming that we just have a few million hunter-gatherers surviving for a few 100,000 years, over to vast post-human empires of more than a Google lives across the vast future. And yes, we might be losing entire galaxies per year, but we better not lose the entire future. Another important thing is to observe that before we undergo the great exodus to spreading across the universe, It might behoove us to coordinate very, very careful, because once we started spreading, it's very hard to go back and communicate and set up the coordination necessary to maintain peace, maximizing value, synchronizing our watches and sharing encryption keys. And we need to figure out what the good steps are. Will MacAskill called this the long reflection. And it might sound utopian that we sit down and get our act together, but we can build the tools to make the tools to make the tools to allow us to do a long reflection. I think it's important to have a positive vision for the future, not just to happily get out of bed in the morning, but also to work on reducing the risks and the dangers that are ahead of us. And I think we should recognize that the mirror image of existential risk is existential hope. Things can turn out really well. In fact, they can turn out to be really grand.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Sheri Wells-Jensen, and I am from Bowling Green State University in beautiful Bowling Green, Ohio, in the United States. My email address and name are on the screen, and my email address is swellsj@bgsu.edu. And the title that I've chosen for my part of the presentation, my part of the panel, fits with Anders' title. It's Grand Futures, Who Will Be There? So if you think about the future, you might get that sort of the hull is breached and we are all lost kind of feeling, and maybe that's not so wrong. And there's a picture on the screen for you of two little astronaut dudes, a big guy and a little guy, and they are in some distress. It does seem like they're in a hull breach situation and things are kind of flying around them and they don't have helmets or socks. They're kind of having a bad time. So you're not wrong to feel stressed. I mean, our autonomic nervous systems respond to stress in the same way no matter what the stress is. If it's your spaceship decompressing or if you're just sitting around reading the news, we seem to be very busy doing very many things very wrong right at the moment. But at the same time, we have done some astoundingly wonderful things. I have a pic here of a couple guys doing some science on the moon. And if you're anything like me, that's just about the coolest thing you can imagine in the whole world or off of the world. That's a glorious thing, and we actually did that. So there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of despair washing around, and sometimes for me, I get feelings of hope and despair sometimes over the same cup of coffee in the morning. But the thing that stabilizes my feelings and the thing that motivates me, again, to keep going is the knowledge that we're all participating in this thing, that we're working on the problem. The problems are big, the problems are serious, the problems might kill us, but we are working on them and we're doing it together, and that matters. That matters to me in how I feel about the world, and it matters to me that I'm participating. And this participation is maybe the key. We all want to know, how do we get people to invest? How do we get people to really commit and do the work that we need to do to help us all get through this? That's the big question, right? How do we do that? And I submit to you that we are making two very serious mistakes. They're systematic, they're ongoing, and they're really baked into our culture. We have to become aware of these mistakes that we're making. We have to take steps to correct them. So what are these mistakes? Well, mistake number one is we're picking the people before we analyze the tasks. And on my screen here, I have a picture of my little buff astronaut dude looking all smug and happy in his mightiness and his chosenness. In 1959, when the United States started to think about having a space program, and we started to pick astronauts, we decided who the astronauts were going to be, what their characteristics were going to be, before we even really honest to heck knew what an astronaut was. We didn't know what they were going to do. We didn't know what it would be like in outer space. We had no idea, but we decided who the people were going to be. And I'm not here to criticize those choices, because look, after all, we did get to the moon, right? We did make the actual moon. So those choices that we made, although I think were problematic in some ways, we made it. They got us through, right? So I'm not here to criticize the past. What I'm hoping to do is to guide choices that we make in the future. So the other thing on the screen, besides my friendly little buff astronaut dude, are the qualifications that are currently in place to become a Mars colonist according to Mars 1. Right? So who are the people that are going to colonize Mars according to this group of folks? So upward of 30,000 people have put in their applications. It's probably even more than that. And we've made decisions about who can do this job without considering what the job is like. So this set of Mars requirements that specify your healthy blood pressure, how tall you're going to be, how well your senses work, that you can see adequately according to what they think adequate is, and the other specifications that they make about your health. They look good if you're recruiting for, say, a traditional soccer team. But these kind of strict criteria mean that we're excluding some people that we might actually need. So do our best scientists, do our best artists, do our best religious leaders necessarily fit these health characteristics and requirements? Are we automatically and a priori disallowing people's participation, and it might turn out that those are the people we need? We don't know what skills we're going to need yet. So what I should have done for this slide actually is give you a picture of a good old big Midwest snowstorm. They're mighty, they're glorious. They usually come kind of in the late afternoon, and the wind blows and the snow goes everywhere, and it's fantastic. It's glorious. But one of the things that happens is it also covers everything, including your driveway. And if you are not a city dweller, then someone's got to go out in the snowstorm and shovel the driveway. And because of some genetic or character flaw or spiritual flaw, I don't know what, but I love shoveling the driveway. It makes me really happy. And I am fierce and mighty, and I go at it with my little bitty shovel out in the dark, in the flurry of the snow and the wind, and the snow is in my hair, it's everywhere, right? And I'm loving it, and I go at it and I shovel, and I get the job done. If anybody passes on the road, walking or sometimes even driving, and they see me as a blind woman out shoveling my driveway, I receive commentary. And usually they don't stop and say, "Hey, nice snowstorm. What a terrific night. You look like you're having fun." They say to me, "What are you doing out shoveling the snow? Someone else should be doing that for you. You should go inside. You should sit down." So this is not really about my innate right to shovel my driveway, because the driveway really doesn't matter. It'll get done. What matters is what they're saying, and not just that they're saying it to me, but they have the habit of saying such things to some people. What they're saying is, in a crisis, and a Midwest snowstorm is not the biggest crisis in the world, but it is kind of a small town crisis. It's a big deal. Things come to a halt. People are needed to keep one another safe. What they're saying is, in a crisis, you are not necessary. You should stand back. You should wait. You should not be fiercely involved. You should not commit. You should go inside and rest. We've decided who we need, and you're not it. And honestly, if we're talking about crises of a global scale, we cannot afford to do that. We don't know who we're going to need. We need everybody working together if we're going to solve global problems on a global scale. We don't know what those problems are going to be like exactly, and we can't afford to exclude people. So mistake number 2, having chosen the people that we have decided are going to be the involved ones, we double down on that decision, and we construct our spaces and our tools and our communication systems on those people. We assume that everyone participating has the same set of needs. So on the screen, these poor little astronaut dudes, they're not having a very good day. Now there seems to be some kind of smoke event, some kind of fire perhaps, and they're struggling. with a fire extinguisher, they're having a couple simultaneous problems besides that their spaceship is on fire. The problems that they're having are these. They can't read the directions on their fire extinguisher. They can't see them in the dark, and they're not in Braille. They're not accessible to them at all. And the situation that they're in calls for someone who can work without being inconvenienced by the dark or the smoke. And they are definitely people who were chosen for this job, and they are definitely people who are dramatically inconvenienced by the dark and the smoke. The principle of universal design tells us that building spaces that accommodate disabled people makes the situation safer and more welcoming and more convenient for everyone else. The crosswalk on the busy street that has an audible signal is useful to the blind person who's listening to traffic. You might want a little extra audio indication that the light has changed. That's fine. But it's also useful to the sighted person who is looking down at her cell phone instead of paying attention to traffic. The door with the bar across it to push it open, instead of the traditional knob to twist, is nice for the person who doesn't have full use of her hands, but it's also handy for the person with an armload of books who needs to get through the door. The curb cut, which allows a standard wheelchair to go on and off of a sidewalk, also is exactly what you need for your cart full of groceries. These aren't courtesies that we extend to people because we're nice. They're features of an environment that reflects the reality that we need everyone's committed participation. If we are intentional, our advancing technology will not erase our differences. It will allow us to live fully into the differences that make us human. Universal design allows us to make spaces that welcome who we genuinely are. The picture here shows my big buff astronaut showing my little guy how to read some Braille. They seem to be having a better day now. The point here is not disability rights per se, although 1 out of 4 people on the planet today does have some disability. The point is that we cannot afford to tell some people, any group of people, women or older people or people who are too young or people from particular countries or people of different colors or people with different sensory abilities, we cannot afford to tell those people that they don't matter and that we don't need them. If they understand themselves to be capable and working on the problem, then our survival chances go up because they will commit to doing their part. And now the timelines that we have to consider here. We do have to consider the 10,000 year timeline, right? The big, grand, glorious projects. If we decide it's ethical to do it and we decide to terraform Mars, then we better start making plans for that, right? If we're going to build space colonies, that's a long project and we can't wait till the last minute to get that done. We have to start on that, on those plans right now. The second time frame that has to be happening simultaneously is, say, the 100-year time frame, the length of a comfortably long human life, the span of time that during which we might manage global warming, right, or prevent thermonuclear war, the kind of a time frame where you can visibly check the progress, right, where you know that what you're doing is going to benefit your own children. But the third time frame, and arguably the one that's going to make the other two possible, is what's happening this weekend. What communities are you in that systematically disempowers some groups of people, telling them that their agency and their participation is not necessary? Every one of us is in a group like that. So every one of us has the chance for some positive big influence. These two big mistakes that we're making, they were not imposed on us by aliens from the sky. They are things that we do. They are things that each of us do actively, and we do them. We make these mistakes every time. And those are things that we can fix. So there's my hope. It can be a grand future, and we desperately need everybody to be there.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the presentation. So let me introduce you to the thought-provoking speakers that you have just heard. Sheri Wells-Jensen is an expert on psycholinguistics, language preservation, Braille, extraterrestrial linguistics, and phonetics. She's an associate professor at Bowling Green State University in the USA, and she plays the ukulele. Anders Sandberg is an expert on neuroscience, transhumanism, cognitive biases, cognitive enhancement, collective intelligence, and neuroethics. He's a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford in the UK, and he's very knowledgeable about Beatles, if you can look at his background. So before I jump into the questions, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about each other's presentations. In my case, very briefly, I would say that I never imagined that we can move stars and push away galaxies and so on. And on the other hand, I was also thinking that I always notice when the Latin American is not in the room, when it's not in the conference, but I never think about other type of people that I'm not usually talking to. And this presentation, Sheri, was really enlightening. Thank you so much to both for both presentations. So Anders, maybe?
So what I really loved about Sheri's presentation is that it finally clicked something I've been kind of groping towards in my big research project, and that is robustness. Universal design is not just about everybody being in there. If you design something that almost any person can use, it's going to be fairly robust under many circumstances. And this goes not just for objects in everyday use, our normal environment, but also for other systems. So when I think about those grand mega scale engineering projects, one of the things I notice that quite often is left out of the literature is thinking about how do you maintain them? Once you build a beanstalk from the surface of a planet out to geostationary orbit, how do you actually repair it? How do you make a Dyson sphere that doesn't have a Kessler cascade when it gets hit by a comet? And that kind of robustness thinking is really necessary. And I think that also gets back to this important question. What are these mega scale structures for? Who are making use of them?
Sheri, if you have some comments, I ask you to please unmute your microphone.
Sorry about that. So the thing that struck me about Anders' contribution in particular was how optimism requires caution. And I think what we're accustomed to with grand vistas of the future is that we think that let's just go blasting forward and go as fast as we can and make it happen because everything is perfect and beautiful. And I think the thing that struck me about Anders' presentation when I listened to it last night and when I re-listened to it today is how the optimism requires caution and that reflective pause where you figure out what the heck you're going to do and why you're going to do it, and that knowledge that we have to start at the ground. And this is one of the things I think that Anders and I have deeply in common, is that knowledge that if we're going to build a thing, we've got to think about the thing first and figure out how we're going to build it and make sure we're doing it right, because it's way harder to retrofit a Dyson sphere. I mean, you could look at it from that level, or just even a spaceship, right? To make systems on a spaceship accessible now is easy because we can build it that way. But if we have to go and take a spaceship that's already built or a habitat that's already up and go, oh wait, we've got to widen these doors and input these, do these different things, that's really hard. And so the easiest thing to do is to use our optimism to fuel the energy that we need to take our time.
Something that came to my mind when I was listening is, how do we bring these concepts, how do we land them? How do we make people to be involved in long-term thinking? And is there best practices maybe you can share with us, or which narratives work very well for triggering these type of emotions of action in people?
One futurist that is largely forgotten these days, but I'm rather fond of him, was Fred Pollack. And in the 1950s, he pointed out that the images of the future in our culture strongly affect how it relates to the future. Now, I think his theory that you can also predict the fate of that culture based on the imagery it has of the future is wrong. The Romans didn't have a positive view of future, but they lasted quite a long while. But it's true that when we start talking about the future, we also quite often use standard images. We have a buff 1950s astronaut. I was smiling at Sheri's the astronauts because they fit in so well with some astronauts that show up in my presentations, where I'm pointing out, look, these guys are not going to survive on interstellar transport. It's going to be little nanomachines or robots, very different. But we use these images to think about the future. And quite often they inspire. There is this saying that every time there is a new Star Trek series, the enrollment in engineering courses goes up a few years later. I don't know whether it's true, but it certainly has affected a lot of thinking. Our smartphones are very much based on the next generation's tricorder. And unfortunately, a lot of the debate about AI safety gets derailed by pictures of the Terminator. So images are powerful. And similarly, telling a compelling story about how it might be to live in future work. But I also think it's useful to look at the general abstractions and just show that, look, almost regardless of what you believe, you want to be in on this train. You want to make it possible to get there. Then you want, of course, to get your voice heard too. But this is actually something that's going to be good for your values. But one of the things I've been looking at, for example, in my book project, is people who don't want mega-scale engineering, who just want a little village where people play cricket and they can drink a cup of tea. How do you get a future that allows them to get that too, besides the moving of galaxies?
And I think what I would add to that is that we're doing a lot of things right. I mean, look at the people who are here. Look at the people who feel motivated. Look at the success that we've had. But then the trick is that we're not even bothering to talk to some groups of people. And like Anders says, the visuals that we use, the language that we use, sends the implicit message that, yeah, we are going to do a bunch of things, but it's kind of like those languages that have the we that means you and I and not that other guy, and the we that means everybody. So there's the inclusive we, which means everyone who can hear me is included. And then there's the exclusive we that means me and my people are included, but my addressee is not. And I feel like we have an exclusive we problem in our messaging about being involved and getting stuff done because of the pictures and because of the language and because of just, and it's not just about us, right? This is not something that we as a community at this conference are doing wrong. This is a worldwide thing that we have baked into systematically into all our cultures that yeah, the future is going to happen, and y'all, some of you get out and push, and the rest of y'all just sit there and ride because you're not valuable pushers.
Perfect. Let's go directly to the questions. Okay. Adrian Kent struggles a bit to justify utilitarian calculations when we are considering truly astronomical numbers of future lives. One reason, not the only, is that it seems that two identical lives wouldn't be twice as valuable as one, and then two very similar ones shouldn't be either. Meaningfully, different lives seem to matter. What does the panel think about that?
So first of all, I think there is value in diversity, kind of direct value, that things are as different as possible. I've been trying to pull together a value theory, write a philosophy paper about it for a long time. I never got it to actually work really well. It's a hard problem. But I do think Adrian is right also about, wait a minute, if I just make a lot of copies of myself, having exactly the same experience, does that count as 100 Anderses or just one? It seems like if they're identical, actually, they should not add as much. And generally, when you try to aggregate across future generations or even across a large population, it's not obvious that just lives sum up. However, in our normal discussions, it seems that every human right now is really unique. And one person adds one life to the whole population of humanity. It might be that it levels off. Once you reach 10 to the 80 people, at that point, there are going to be a lot of people who are actually fairly similar. Maybe they don't quite add as much, but it might be that that leveling off happens at a very astronomically large population. But it's an important thing to think about because it actually determines a little bit on how much appetite we should have for the universe. Maybe the value levels off after you gobbled up a few galaxies and turned them into happiness or people or whatever it is that is valuable. So maybe that's the point where you should just stop and regard the rest as a nature preserve. This is one of those philosophical questions we probably should iron out a bit more before we decide what to do with the universe.
And I'm just going to straight up agree with the question. I have a lot of trouble justifying that kind of logic myself as well. And I just don't. I don't think it's the best way of looking at the future, simply because if we had time travel and we knew what was going to be handy, then maybe we could optimize, right? But we don't have time travel, and we don't know what's going to happen. So the struggle to optimize, or the struggle to figure out which kinds of people we need, I think is just profoundly misguided. And maybe we will get to the point where lots and lots of people are the same. I think people sort of feel like that right now to some extent. Like people, I mean, that's why advertising works, right? We feel like this group of people will want this thing. And maybe to some extent that's true superficially. But I think the more that you include people and the deeper you go, the differences, I think expand, right? So that I just have to agree that we can't just count people as being.
Sheri, for some reason, we cannot hear you. Anders, can you hear us? You're back, Sheri. Don't worry.
Oh, okay.
Connectivity issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have to pass this comment to you, Sheri. Alex Freeman is saying that she was part of the NASA astronaut selection, and it was always what made her laugh was that they required good vision at both long and short range, when it seemed like a job in which long distance vision was very little required. Everything you need to see, respond to, is within a meter or so of your face. So thank you Alex, for sharing this.
Yeah, that's true. And also we know, I mean, and this is like another thing that's really important. We know that exposure to microgravity damages your vision anyway, right? So maybe it makes sense to start people with maximally great vision and hope for the best. But maybe that doesn't make any sense. If visual degradation is going to be expected, then maybe we just should account for that.
A question
Maybe it's even a good idea to start with people who wouldn't get their vision degraded. Maybe we should send blind people to space.
Well, and I mean, honestly, like if there's a crisis and the lights go out, that thing on airplanes where they don't let blind people sit in, well, they don't let any disabled people. Drunks can sit in the exit rows. You can drink as much as you want, but disabled people can't. But for my money, when the lights go out and the cabin fills with smoke and no one can see, I would like somebody that's used to not looking to like go, oh, I guess I'll open this exit door, rather than someone that says, oh, holy hell, the lights are gone and I'm terrified of the dark and I can't do anything in the dark. So yeah, I think we honestly, I think it's not crazy to think those thoughts.
Well, Sheri, I like the picture that you had on your presentation when someone is teaching Braille to one of the astronauts, right? That's super good and complementary as well to the job that they are doing there, I guess, if they don't want to send other people with blindness. Hayden is asking, what do you both think about settling Mars as a way to reduce existential risk? Is it a centuries-long project we could and should do? Or will it cost a lot of money and not do anything to help for centuries?
I think it's useful to have a backup, but it's not the most cost-effective way of reducing existential risk right now. I think long-term, Elon Musk is totally right. Being multiplanetary is useful because if you're sufficiently far apart, you become decorrelated. In ecology, there is this concept of a meta-population. You have different patches where a species inhabits, and occasionally it goes extinct in one of the patches, but then that patch gets kind of resettled from other patches. That vastly increases survival against uncorrelated risks. So I think it's totally right that, yep, we need space. Long term, we need. But right now, it might not necessarily be the best investment to try to put a lot of people to Mars. But on the other hand, the technologies that would make a Mars base possible are darn useful for making Earth safer too. We want to have enclosed ecosystems that are really reliable. That would be very useful in disasters or to make sustainable agriculture. We want automated manufacturing, at least with some safeguards against dangerous things. And we want automated recycling systems of super high efficiency. If we had those, we would be very happy. So by the point when we can settle Mars really well, we also get tools for settling Earth rather well.
And what I would throw on top of that is, I do think we have ethical questions still about what's on Mars and do we have a right to it. And I think we as a community are pretty torn about that. Me personally, I want to go. Let's go. But I also want to acknowledge the very real ethical questions of what's already on Mars and do we have a right to go tromping around there and wreck stuff? And are we grown up enough to treat Mars with respect? We aren't doing a very good job on Earth. And so I sort of hang in the middle of those questions myself. Do we have a right to survive by killing other things? I don't know. That's a difficult question for me, and I'm not quite sure how to answer it. So I think that money is a solvable problem. If we want something bad enough, the money happens. We certainly have money for all the war we want. Money, I think, can be created when we ethically decide that we're going to do a thing. And I think I also agree with Anders that maybe that's not the next step, but anything that we do in science that increases our know-how and our technical ability is a good thing if we if we can take that pause, right, that long pause before we just dive into doing things and think carefully about what we're doing and why and who we might hurt by doing it.
Yesterday, I saw that the budget for the new movie of James Cameron, Avatar 2, it's 1 billion. And I was thinking, how much can we do at CSER with 1 billion? Okay, next question. Stuart Parkinson, one of my favorite questions. Is this discussion too human-centered? How should we value non-human animal intelligence and potential non-biological machine intelligence?
So I generally think, yep, we should care about all entities that matter morally. And then, of course, I can get into a long lecture about where I think I draw the line. And I think, in general, I have no problem with assigning rights and moral value to certain forms of artificial intelligence and definitely to aliens. And I think many animals are moral patients and so on. And then I get into some trouble because we might design artificial intelligence that is not a moral patient or a moral agent, which might be actually darn useful. What about the animals that are very simple, but they might still feel pain? One big problem for me is animal suffering. It might be that natural biospheres contain an enormous amount of suffering that we really have a moral obligation to do something about. I personally don't agree with that view, but I kind of see the problem. And this is definitely something you want to think about before you see the rest of the universe with life. If it then turns out that, oh dear, there is a lot of suffering animals out there. So generally, I want to have a fairly generalist view of who and what counts. I'm not entirely certain Mars as the non-biological planet really counts, but it matters to us. We humans have been watching it for a very long time, and we might actually ourselves be rather upset if it kind of gets degraded. I think many people would say industrialization of the moon, please keep it on the other side. All the romance novelists have been looking at this side, and we really want to keep it for historical reasons, but that's in the human heart. But I do think that there are probably going to be quite a lot of diverse rights holders in the future that we want to make sure that we don't run roughshod over.
I think I have two responses to this as well. I have more of a Buddhist ethic about the rights of living things. And I don't think that because we're smarter than them, that the animals have fewer rights. And this is difficult because we're obviously, as stewards of the planet, we're not doing a good job, and we are killing the creatures that we should be shepherding or protecting in other ways. So I have deep reservations about what we're doing on Earth now, and I want us to take that moment to figure it out. But also, it's possible to do and believe and care passionately about more than one thing at a time. So I think that we can spend some of our money frivolously, especially if it helps us in some way, right? And we can even spiritually, psychologically, whatever, and we can spend money figuring out how to go to the moon and set up a space station there, while we at the same time make sure that we're preserving the territory that chimpanzees need and that songbirds need. And I think to do otherwise is a betrayal of who we are, because we're not just people. We are shaped by our environment and by all the other creatures that we share this planet with. And we are so ignorant about who they are and what they do and how smart they are and how they feel and how they live and how it is to be them. We have so much work to do here at home, but that doesn't mean we can't also be doing work in outer space, because there are some people who are suited for the work at home, some people who are the people we need to study songbirds, and some people who are the people we need to figure out how to put solar panels up on the moon. I think we can do both.
There is one question from Tom Hobson, and he is wondering about the sciences we use now to understand the future are shaped by social, normative, ethical, and political factors. They reflect and reproduce what we value and the types of life we think are important. So the question is, how do you both think we should reconcile this with our field's preference for scientific method and especially rationalism?
Well, you use the tools you have. So if somebody gave me a better tool for understanding the future, I would be very happy to use it. But I'd rather have a lot of tools in my toolbox. So when you look at standard futurists, there is a whole bunch of tools already. When I'm working about the very far futures, one of the tools I'm using is astrophysics. And you can kind of say, oh, that's so reductionist, but it also works really, really well. It's also useful to know when tools don't work. For example, predicting what humans will do in a few years. Yeah, we have some inklings because we're human and we have a bit of social sciences and humanities, but it's very hard. The tools for talking about human futures have to be different and are going to be giving us much more uncertain answers. So I think we should be methodologically agnostic. We should actually allow different methods. And then we should also be ready to criticize the methods rather fiercely. But I found that quite often people bring it out saying, oh, look, you're using that reductionist tool. And didn't you know that math was used by some bad people in the past? As if that is a good argument for throwing away the tool. If you want to shovel away the snow, I assume that snow shovels have been used in various bad ways, but they're probably still pretty good for shoveling snow. So you want to use a good one. If somebody can come up with an even cooler, better way of handling it, great. So I think the real question is, can we get enough diversity of our toolboxes?
Yeah, so also first off, if you discover a better snow shovel, please send it to me immediately, because that's a need that I have. But I think that Anders' point is an excellent one. And from my perspective, the tools that we have come from the people that we are. And the people that we are come from the people that we've already decided are going to use those tools, right? So if we have more of a diversity of people involved in science, we will get a more diverse set of views. But then we can't just sit back and quietly let that happen. What I think that we need to do is every assumption we make, we should take a hammer and smash it. So if we're making an assumption about a thing, we should go, what if that's wrong? I mean, this is the only way we're ever going to understand aliens, right? We have to take every assumption that we have and wreck it. Not because it's bad and not because we can't, keep using it in some other context, but our assumptions trap us into methodological errors, right? If you don't have there are tools that you need to discover different physical phenomena. And if you're not thinking outside your methodological box, you won't even think to invent the tool you need to discover the thing that you don't know about. So exactly, I think that we need to respect the science that we've done and honor the way that we have done it, because, we wiped out smallpox, and that's not a small thing. So the tools that we have been successful. And we need to honor the honor the process that has brought us this far. But now we're just a little bit smarter, and we can afford to be a little bit more diverse. I don't know if afford is the word I want, but we should be being a little more diverse, and that will bring us diversity of perspective. And also, it's really fun. The assumption busting game is a really fun game to play. If you take an idea and say, well, what if everything about that is completely wrong? How would that sort out into something maybe different that I could test and play with in a new way?
So in my vast book I'm writing right now about the grand futures, I have one chapter that is getting annoyingly long, and that is essentially, what if we are wrong about various things? So I'm going through the various physical theories I'm leaning on and looking at, okay, could this be really wrong, and what happens if we break that assumption? And I know, of course, that all the readers are going to say, Anders, you're not doing a serious enough job here on breaking assumptions. You still have a lot left. But I'm kind of saying, okay, at 100 pages length, the chapter is probably long enough. And you learn so much from that process. What if quantum mechanics was wrong? In what way could it even be wrong? That in itself turns out to be a surprisingly good question. What if we're wrong about the value of a future? It's kind of useful to use that to needle my fellow philosophers too.
Definitely, philosophers are they are doing so much for my life right now, so I'll tell you that later. A question from Coleman Snell is, how do you see people's sense of meaning connecting to the question of how to get people to invest to do the work in the short and long term?
This is a great question. I mean, what we're doing right now is heartbreaking. That we have so many people who are passionate and care deeply and would be involved, except that we have systematically told them, forget it, we don't need you to go home. And sometimes that's couched in, oh, I just can't even tell you how many different things it's couched in, right? It's couched in fake kindness. It's couched in selfishness. It's fear. It's all of these things. Again, it's assumptions about, we make assumptions about who we are, about who each other is. And then we act on those instead of realizing, having the humility to realize that, yeah, we've accomplished some things, but we need all these other people. So I think the very first thing that we have to do to survive is to address large social inequalities like racism, like ableism, like sexism, like ageism. All those are not just things and are ethically repugnant. Those are things that actually stall science and keep people from being involved in solving problems.
And many of the institutions we create then perpetuate the problems accidentally. Just think about us in academia. We're suffering from this very serious case of credentialism. If you haven't got a PhD, oh, come back when you got one, dear. Okay, that leaves out an awful lot of people who could actually do useful stuff, but don't have the time or can't afford to do a PhD. And indeed, I think the creation of alternative institutions is one of the most important things that is possible these days. I've seen excellent work being done by various think tanks and organizations just outside the doors of academia, doing the same job or even a better job than academia, but without necessarily the extra, the cumbersome bureaucracy we get inside. On the other hand, we of course get a lot of the prestige, sometimes rather unfairly, but if you set it up right, we can actually work together. But I'm hoping for even more innovation when people actually both come up with their own solution, or we who already have some privileged position can throw out a line to them and help them in. In some cases, it might just be recruitment. One of the big problems is if you have an organization that consists largely of a particular group of people, when they recruit, they're going to get more people like themselves, even if they don't intend to. So deliberately trying to get more diverse recruitment is useful. But then the problem is we even have a limited idea what diversity is. So typically when talking about recruitment, people will talk about gender and race. But then again, what about academic discipline? Many sociology groups probably would do well by having an engineer in their midst. They, of course, never think about that because they would be much more interested in making sure that they had the right racial composition rather than realize that somebody having this annoying tendency to try to make a blueprint and solving problems might actually be just the right kind of addition to the discourse needed.
Yeah, and I look around like my English department, and really, really, what you need to be an English professor. And I love my colleagues. They don't. I'm not trying to, slam on my colleagues, because they're great and I love them. And the qualification for being an English professor is you've got to sort of be able to sit around and think things. And so, what makes a bunch of straight, white, middle class, able-bodied people better at thinking things? But that's who we are. Largely, we are largely straight. We are largely cisgender. We are largely white in small town Ohio. We are largely able-bodied in a traditional sense. We are our neurology is our neurology. We don't have autistic folk on our faculty, and all these kinds of perspectives. These are folks who could easily do the job that we do, thinking thoughts, and we don't have them there, and that's not an accident. That didn't just happen by the roll of the dice, because by roll of the dice, there would be a lot more diversity in the disciplines, right? And so that's one of the things that we have to go after.
So, playing a devil's advocate, I want to ask you this. Why do we need to extend our existence? What good do we do to the rest of ecosystem? Besides, I don't know, maybe avoiding some asteroids collapsing with Earth. What do you think?
Well, my basic answer, because it's so fun. I think life is really, really enjoyable. That might, of course, be my mindset. There are certainly philosophers argue, no. Life is really bad for the unfortunate beings that happen to be alive, and it would be so much better if we were all just quietly dead. So there is a discussion about it, but in the long run, beings that find life meaningful tend to dominate the universe. And I do think that we actually add something to the universe. We are the kind of creature that can find things better and worse. We can experience good things and bad things, and we can then try to rearrange the world to have a bit more of the good things. Rocks don't do that. We have added something interesting. Originally, the universe had mostly gas and eventually a bit of rocks. And then you got living beings that did a little bit of its evaluation. With us, and maybe aliens somewhere else, you suddenly got a lot more potential value. And it's very possible that there are even higher forms of value that we can't even conceive of, that's going to be totally obvious in a few billion years. And then we're going to look back and say, yeah, before we emerged, there was this little weird intelligent slime colonizing the universe. But then real value showed up. So I think there is also this open-endedness. Now, I think there is still an important question, and many people have rather different takes on what value theory to use. And it's an interesting thing to see what could encompass the most value theories. Again, some people might just want to have a nice little village with sensible social relations. Others might want to have a tail and change species. Others would say, yeah, we really need to spread maximum happiness or survival very long. The question is, what's the maximum group we can actually get to agree to disagree about value and still get most of what we wish for?
Yeah, I'm going to passionately agree and disagree at the same time with what Anders just said, if I can, because I think that for large amounts of people on the earth, life is suffering. I mean, they're hungry and their children die and horrible, horrible things are happening, and we're trying to kill the planet that sustains us. And so I get it. I totally get it. I get the question. And what I would have to say in return is I think the arc of the universe does bend toward justice. And on the days when I don't believe my community and think about, well, what are the people around me think it's worth it, then forget. We all try to survive, right? I mean, even when I'm feeling the most miserable, still if you say jump off this cliff, I as an individual probably won't. And I wouldn't advocate ethically for the end of other people, even if I personally would want to jump off a cliff. So I think the answer to that question is about community and about what most of us want. And the current email, I was listening to Anders that, maybe one of the answers to Fermi's paradox about why we haven't found the other aliens is that at some point, sufficiently advanced civilizations decide that ethically they shouldn't exist anymore and then wipe themselves out for that reason. I haven't thought through that all the way yet, but I think that that's conceivable. So I think it's a good question, and I think it's one of those Pascal's wager kind of things, right? You bet it's safer to bet on life and continuing, because once you're done, you're done. Like Anders said in his beginning, right? If we blow this, we've blown everything, and we've sacrificed the right to make it, or the possibility to make it better.
We have 3 minutes left. So what I would like is to ask you 1 or 2 actions for our audience to take after this presentation. And with that, we finish. Thank you.
So my suggestion would be to go around and start looking at tools for better coordination. Things like Kickstarter, Patreon, or various markets, or tools for setting up in institutions and communities. We have had a revolution over the past few decades, and not just in terms of social media, but actually better ways of allowing groups to both coordinate what they want to do and even put together money to do it. Because it's kind of a lovely thing that Elon Musk wants to build a Mars base for his own money. That's great, but you can't always rely on billionaires doing the right thing. And in fact, it's much nicer if you can get involved yourself. It's also a matter of diversity and backup, because, well, Elon might change his mind. We might actually want to have a lot other forms of coordination. And I think it's up to us to find better tools of coordination, because it has improved markedly over the recent few years. It's just that we're still bad at it.
And I'm gonna do the complimentary move here. I think that your action can and should be individual to begin to change the institutions that you work in. So look around yourself, look around your communities. What kinds of people are involved? What kinds of people are in leadership positions? Do you know how to work against racism, to start one? And then do you know how to work against ableism? So who is involved in the groups that you are involved with? What concrete steps has your leadership taken, or if you are in a position of leadership, to diversify those groups? Who is your lawyer? Who is your hairdresser? Who babysits your kids? Who does your taxes? Who mows your lawn? Are any of those people who you interact with in a commercial and collegial and just sociological manner, are any of those people different than you? And why not? And that's the first step, I think, is diversifying our individual networks and communicating with everyone around you that you're part of our network and you belong here and we need you. And I think that sort of work is necessary to do in the aggregate. And but before that can happen, it's essential to do on the individual level.
Thank you so much for so much food for thought. Sheri, you have the lightning perfectly ending this presentation now. So thank you so much. And I invite all the audience to please reach the panelists with your questions that I was not able to read, and to listen to Sean that is coming with a fireside chat next. Thank you.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.
Yes, and also with you.
Perfect.